Chapter 741. Barbara looked at her and said, "You're jealous." Riley froze. It took her quite a while before she finally came around to her senses. She picked up a pillow and threw it at Barbara. "Are you here to laugh at me?" Barbara picked the pillow up and put it back on the bed. All right. After all, Louis saved you. Besides, you aren't as seriously injured as he is, so I think you should check him out." Riley did not reply. In the evening, Riley walked toward Louis's ward. She hesitated for a long while in front of the door before she finally turned the doorknob. Louis was reading a magazine on the bed. There was a gauze on his cheek and a bruise on the corner of his lips. He was stunned for a moment when he lifted his head and saw Riley. After that, he put the magazine on the side and asked, "What brought you here?" Riley stopped in front of his bed. She was so nervous that she did not know where to put her hands. In the end, she clasped them in front of her and said, "I'm here to visit you, of course." Louis chuckled. "I thought you had forgotten about it." Riley replied in a muffled voice, "Do I look like an ingrate to you?" Louis nodded. "Well, you are." Riley wanted to say something in return, but she did not do so in the end. She turned her face sideways and said, "I'll let you off this time, since you're injured." Suddenly, Louis reached out to her. "What?" Riley asked, her voice filled with confusion. "I want to get off the bed, so help me," he replied. "I remember you didn't injure your legs, right?" Riley asked again in confusion. He chuckled lightly and said, "Is this how you treat someone who saved your life?" Riley was stumped. She walked forward and grabbed Louis's arm. Louis turned around and sat at the side of the bed. Since there was an IV drip hanging from the back of his hand, Riley picked up the bottle for him. Perhaps it was because he was too tall and the bottle was held low that the blood flowed back into the infusion tube. He hissed out in pain and looked at her. Blood. It was only then that Riley raised her arm higher. The blood flowed back from the infusion tube, but there was still some leftover in it. "Can you lower your arm a little bit?" Riley asked, looking a little flustered. Louis took a deep breath and took over the bottle in her hand. He raised it slightly, and the blood flowed back into the veins. Riley was rendered speechless. She followed behind Louis, and Louis suddenly stopped. He turned sideways and looked at her. "Are you going to follow me into the restroom?" Riley was stunned. And it was only then that she noticed that he was heading toward the restroom. Her face burned red with embarrassment, and she turned around. "You should have told me earlier." Louis chuckled and walked into the restroom. Riley fanned herself with her hand to calm herself down. She felt embarrassed. She glanced toward the restroom, and something she had seen on the internet popped up in her head. Would a man like him poop? What would he look like when he's pooping? Would he sit on the toilet and say, "Be a good boy and come out of yourself," with an evil grin on his lips? Pfft. Riley giggled at her own thoughts. The scene was so bizarre that she hastily killed the thought. It was only when she heard the sound of flushing water that she lowered her head and held her giggle back. Louis noticed something and turned his head around to look at her through squinted eyes. "What are you laughing at?" Riley raised her head and pushed all the thoughts to the back of her mind. She replied with a serious face, "Nothing." Louis studied her for a while and then said meaningfully, "You didn't, huh?" Riley blinked her eyes. He paused for a while before continuing. "You didn't peek when I was in the restroom, right?" Chapter 742. Riley's face sank and she harumphed. Who the hell would peek at you when you're using the toilet? You must be delusional. Besides, you have nothing to look at." Louis replied half-heartedly. "Who knows if you want to take advantage of me or not?" Riley pointed at herself. "Me? Want to take advantage of you?" She sneered as if she had heard the funniest joke in the world and said, "If I really want to take advantage of you, I would have, he lifted his brows and interrupted her, you would have what? Clearing her throat, Riley replied, why should I tell you? Louis did not say anything in return. When he saw that the 4 drip in the bottle was almost finished, he pushed the service bell. The nurse came in. She pulled the needle out of the back of his hand and said to him gently, Sir, you have to get an anti-inflammatory injection tomorrow and the day after. He nodded. The nurse then left with the bottle. Riley clicked her tongue and said, this nurse is so good to you. If she could do the same to me, I would have no problem getting a few more days of shots. After all, she had suffered a lot because of the nurse. Louis looked at her and asked, do you want to know why? She was stunned. Know what? He beckoned to her with a straight face. Come over here. And I'll tell you. Although Riley was skeptical about him, she still walked toward him. Louis pulled her, causing her to lose her balance, and she fell on him. Both of them fell onto the bed. Riley was undoubtedly the one lying on top, and her lips inadvertently kissed his chin. She was stunned, and just like a malfunctioned robot, her brain went blank. Louis chuckled deeply, and his voice rang out above her. See? I knew you wanted to take advantage of me. You. Riley jerked her head up. And she felt as if a bolt of lightning had coursed through her body when her lips accidentally touched his. Louis lowered his head and fixed his gaze on her lips. As if compelled by a mysterious force, he put his hand on the back of her neck and planted a kiss on her lips. Riley's eyes widened in shock when she realized what Louis was doing, and she even had forgotten to take her breath. Larissa came in and was taken aback by the scene before her eyes. After Riley came around to her senses, she pushed Louis away and stormed out of the ward. Larissa looked at her fleeing figure before turning back to her son, who sat expressionlessly on the bed. She asked, did you make it? Louis shrugged. The coast was brightly lit. A group of people was having a party around a bonfire on the beach of Winston Island to welcome the Autumn Bonfire Festival. There was an unlimited supply of beers, seafood, and barbecued food. Wearing their masks, Maisie and Nolan were walking across the crowd. She grabbed Nolan's hand and said, there's food over there. I'll go and check it out. She let go of his hand and ran toward the direction she was pointing at just now. Nolan shook his head helplessly and said, watch your step. He had never once looked away from Maisie. After all, there were a lot of people here, and he did not want anything bad to happen. Maisie stood in front of the stall and ordered every food in front of her. It seemed like she was enjoying herself very much. Helios was wearing a mask as well and was accompanied by his assistant. He recognized Nolan in a single glance. He picked up a can of beer and walked toward Nolan. I thought you didn't like this kind of occasion. Nolan took over the can of beer and replied, but my wife likes it. Helios laughed. There will be a lot more people tonight. You'd better keep an eye on your wife. I'd do so even without your dash. Nolan looked toward Maisie and was stunned. He put the can of beer down and walked into the crowd. Nina asked, what is Mr. Goldman doing? Helios squinted his eyes and put the half-empty can of beer on the table. Go help him. Nolan came to the stall and asked the owner about Maisie. However, the stall owner said he did not know about her. Nolan looked around anxiously. There were a lot of people on the beach, but Maisie was nowhere to be found. Chapter 743. A surge of worry and fear rose from Nolan's stomach pit and filled his heart whole. He seemed to have experienced this kind of feeling before as well. Something bad happened, and Maisie suddenly disappeared before his eyes. Nolan moved his hand over his pocket, only to realize they had not brought their phones with them. Helios handed his phone to him and said, maybe you should use mine. Nolan did not reject it. The first thing he should do was to look for Maisie, so he couldn't care about other things right now. However, he could not remember Maisie's phone number at a crucial moment like this. He gripped the phone tightly, and his veins were bulging from the back of his hand. Phone number. What is going on? It's somewhere in my head. But what's her number again? When Helios saw that Nolan's fingers were hovering over the dialing button and he did not enter the phone number after a long while, he opened up the contact list for him and said, "You can find her number by entering her name." Nolan's face sank. However, the situation did not permit him to question Helios why he would have Maisie's number. He did as he was told and called Maisie. Maisie did not answer the call even though he had called her many times. Nina then chimed in, "There are so many people on the beach. It's very unlikely that she would be taken away by other people." Helios nodded. "Then let's spread out and look for her." Nolan gave the phone back to him without turning his head and said, "I'll go over there." The boundless sea had dissolved into the dark night. No one could see what was in there on the other side of the sea. There was a gazebo under a row of coconut trees beside a rock. Maisie walked into the gazebo, and then she saw some glowing blue jellyfish floating in the sea. It was only then that she realized that these jellyfish emitted the faint blue glow. She snapped herself back to reality and looked at the crowd in the distance. She had been under the impression Nolan would come with her, but apparently she was wrong. Oh, shit. She hurriedly rushed out of the gazebo. She wanted to call Nolan but hadn't brought her phone with her. She was certain that Nolan must be looking anxiously around for her after realizing that she was gone. Suddenly, she bumped into a person and nearly fell to the ground had it not been for him to support her in the nick of time. Their surroundings were too dark, so she couldn't see his face clearly. After expressing her gratitude, she pushed him away. "It's me. Mr. Boucher?" Maisie was stunned. She lifted her head and squinted her eyes. Helios was wearing a mask, but judging from his face exposed in the air, she knew that he was Helios. Helios released his hand and asked, "What are you doing here?" "Helios." Nolan stormed toward Helios, and just when Maisie was about to say something, he threw a punch at Helios, causing his mask to fall to the ground. Maisie was startled and hastily went forward to stop him. "What are you doing?" "Nolan." Nolan suppressed the anger in his chest, and his eyes were even darker than the night. "When did you guys start seeing each other behind my back?" Maisie was stunned. "What?" Helios got up from the ground and wiped the blood from the corner of his lips. He lifted his head and looked at Nolan. "Do you think you'd listen to us right now?" Nolan took a step forward and grabbed him by his collar, the veins on the back of his hand bulging. Maisie pushed him away and shouted, "Nolan, stop it." Nolan pushed Maisie away, and it took Maisie a few steps before she regained her balance. His eyes were red around the rims as he glared at her. A sarcastic grin tugged at the corner of his lips as he asked, "If I hadn't come with him, how would I have seen you guys hugging each other?" "Hugging each other? Helios and me?" Maisie frowned. Helios was holding her. They weren't hugging. "Huh, I get it now." He looked at Helios. "You were lying when you said you came here for a business investment. In reality, it's because Maisie is here. After all, you even have her contact number. You proposed to split up and find her as an excuse to avoid me so that you two could meet each other in secret." Before Maisie could say anything, Helios threw a punch at Nolan. Chapter 744. This was the first time Helios punched Nolan in front of Maisie, and this was also the first time Maisie saw Helios lose his cool in front of everyone. Helios looked at Nolan expressionlessly and said, "I've long wanted to do this. Since 3 years ago, when you said you were giving her to me in front of her." Nolan froze. Helios stepped forward and grabbed Nolan's collar. "We have grown up together since we were kids, so you should know me very well. If I really wanted to get her from you, do you think you'd stand a chance against me?" Maisie loosened her fist and took a deep breath. "Mr. Boucher, let him go. I have something to talk to him about." Helios let Nolan go. He bent down to pick the mask up from the ground, dusted the soil from his shirt, turned around. and left. Maisie looked at Nolan calmly and said, I have Helios' contact number because when he was filming a movie, he was the guarantor when his crew rented the jewelry from Soul Jewelry. When you were hiding at the lighthouse for an afternoon that day. How do you think I would know you were there? It was him who told me. Something in the depth of Nolan's eyes cracked, but she did not give him the chance to speak. I have his contact number, but I rarely call him. You can forget everything about me. But you don't have any right to doubt me, Nolan. Z. You said I'm seeing Helios, right? Yes, I'm seeing him. Is this the answer you want to hear? Isn't this what you wanted 3 years ago? Are you happy now? Maisie said before turning around. Suddenly, Nolan went forward and hugged her from the back. Maisie tried to break herself free, but he just tightened his arms. He buried his head in her shoulder and said, I'm sorry, Z. I shouldn't have doubted you. I'm sorry. Maisie stopped moving. His arms were shaking as he continued. I didn't mean it. It's just that I don't feel secure since I can't remember anything between us. My instinct told me that both of you have a good relationship. I'm jealous about it. I don't like it. Maisie's eyelashes trembled, but she did not say anything. Nolan turned her over to face him and pulled his hand to put at his cheek, his skin cold. Z, you can beat me and scold me, but please don't just keep silent. He grabbed her into his arms and rested his chin on the top of her head. As long as you can forgive me, I'll promise you anything. Maisie lifted his ear to look at him and said, promise me you won't doubt me again. Okay, I promise, he replied without any hesitation. Apologize to Helios. He fell silent for a while before pouting. But he beat me too just now. That's because you deserve it. Maisie tried to push him away, but Nolan did not allow her to do that. All right. I promise you. I'll apologize to him tomorrow. Inside the hotel room, Nina brought Helios a first aid kit. While she was tending to the wound on the corner of his lips, she said, how could Mr. Goldman punch you so hard? Your fans' hearts will break when they see this wound on your face. Helios chuckled and looked at her through a mirror. It's just a wound. It's not that serious. Nina threw the cotton swab in the trash can and kept all the medicines back in the first aid kit. You should be grateful that it's just a wound. What if it's a nasty gash? Helios chuckled but did not say anything. Nina's phone rang and she froze. It's Mr. Lynch. She picked up that call, and Morgan asked her to give the phone to Helios. She did as she was told, and Helios asked, what's wrong? What are you doing on Winston Island? Mr. Wallace said he's preparing a movie, and he wants to see you for an audition tomorrow. Helios lowered his head and replied, I have something I need to attend to. Help me put off all other projects if there are any. Chapter 745. Morgan fell silent for a while before saying, all right, then. Suit yourself. Do what you want to do. After he hung up the call, Helios handed the phone back to Nina. Nina looked at him and asked, Mr. Wallace has a huge reputation in the entertainment industry. Even the most top-tier celebrities wouldn't dare to say no to him. If you reject him, wouldn't he? Don't worry, I'll explain to him afterward. Besides, the time limit the Bouchers gave me is almost up. I can't rely on my achievements in the entertainment industry to convince my family. If Helios wanted to part ways with his family, he first had to get recognition from his grandfather. In other words, he had to get the investment project in Winston Island. Meanwhile, Maisie threw a pillow and blanket on the floor. She turned to Nolan and said, you're going to sleep here tonight. After that, she turned around and closed the door. Nolan was a tad slower. He tried to turn the doorknob, but Maisie had locked the door from the inside. He leaned against the door and pleaded helplessly, please forgive me, Z. Do you really have the heart to kick me out of bed? Yes, I do. And I'd love to do it. Bastard. You took advantage of your amnesia and thought I was meeting with another guy. And now you still want to sleep with me? Go to hell. Maisie returned to her bed, took another set of bedsheets, and ignored Nolan. She turned down the light beside the bed and lay down. After a short while, Nolan stopped talking. When the susurration in the living room drifted into her ears, she turned her head around and cast her gaze on the door that separated her and Nolan apart. Well, I've already given him a pillow and a blanket. With that thought in her mind, she turned around and closed her eyes. Sleep came to her easily, and by the time she woke up, it was already morning. Maisie came to the living room. Nolan was sleeping curled up like a frozen shrimp on the couch. When she saw the blanket on the floor, her heart shuddered, and she felt a bit sorry for him. She picked the blanket up from the floor and laid it on top of him. When her finger touched his skin, she found out that his body was cold. It was autumn right now. The air conditioner was operating, so. Did he sleep like this for the whole night? Nolan, just when she was about to say something, Nolan turned around and secured her tightly in his arms. A surge of chilliness transferred from Nolan's body to hers, and she forgot to break herself free from his arms. It seemed like Nolan had woken up, but at the same time, he also seemed like he was still fast asleep. He did not open his eyes at all as he mumbled, "Cold." He tightened his arms subconsciously and turned around, causing Maisie to get sandwiched between him and the couch. Nolan buried his face into her shoulder and mumbled, sounding like a kid asking for a pat, "Hug me." Maisie unconsciously stretched her arms forward and wrapped them around his body. In the next second, Nolan cracked his eyes open, and a smile played around his lips. He had deliberately thrown the blanket on the floor and turned down the air conditioner before Maisie woke up. His plan worked, and it seemed to him that bracing himself against the cold blast of air from the air conditioner for more than 10 minutes was not in vain. Maisie felt something was under her. She grabbed it, and it was the air conditioner remote control. Maisie squinted her eyes dangerously. She turned her head around and saw Nolan was looking at her nervously. She kicked Nolan down from the couch and shouted, filling the entire living room with her voice, well, Nolan. Do you think a trick like this will work on me? You're dead." The atmosphere was tense as the four of them enjoyed their breakfast in a private room. Nolan was sitting opposite Helios. Both men had taken a punch each last night. It was just that compared to the wound at the corner of Helios' lips, the bruise on Nolan's cheek was not that obvious. Both of them had a dark expression etching on their faces as soon as they stepped into the private room. They stared at each other gloomily, and it seemed as if they would get into a fight with each other should anything go wrong. Chapter 746. Nina, who was sitting next to Maisie, deliberately changed the subject in order to ease the atmosphere in the private room. "I wasn't able to go to the hot springs yesterday. So why don't we go there tonight?" Helios calmly picked up his chopsticks and placed a piece of sushi on the plate in front of him, while Nolan grabbed a cup of tea and took a sip from it. Nina stared at Maisie, who looked calm and composed, with a pitiful and innocent gaze as if she was seeking her help. Maisie lifted her gaze and glanced at them, then turned her head to face Nolan. "Nolan, do you still remember what you promised me last night?" Nolan froze while drinking his tea, placed the teacup down heavily, and stared at Helios. Helios narrowed his eyes. Nolan forced 2 words through his lips after a long while. "I'm sorry." He sounded like he said that very reluctantly. Helios did not even lift his head. "I didn't hear you." Nolan clenched his hand that was holding the teacup and gnashed his teeth. "I'm sorry that I hit you last night. But you did hit back too, so we're even now." "Oh." Helios lifted his gaze to look at him. "Since you've apologized, I'll reluctantly accept it." Nolan laughed angrily as his gloomy gaze met with that of Helios. "You can refuse to accept it." Helios did not hesitate. "I don't want to accept it either. The domineering aura of the two men present was on full blast. The atmosphere turned even more freezing and terrifying than how it was before this. Maisie covered her forehead with her palm. It's definitely true that these two are men who will die for their dignity. She looked at Helios. Nolan had punched him because of her, and she felt so sorry for that. Mr. Boucher, is the wound on the corner of your lips fine now? Helios smiled. It's fine. It's just a tiny laceration. Nolan lowered his head and poked at the sushi on the plate with his chopsticks, feeling a little unreconciled. I got beaten too. Why aren't you showing the same care to me? Maisie looked at him and scoffed. Didn't you look almighty and strong last night when you decided to hit someone else? You even turned to extreme ways in order to ask for forgiveness this morning. And you're telling me that you need someone else's care now? Nolan was at a loss for words. Helios gave off a mocking and merciless laugh. You were very powerful and fierce last night, so you shouldn't be in need of anyone's concern now, should you? Nolan was so furious that his handsome face dimmed. No one will think that you're a mute if you don't speak. Helios responded by provoking him. Why? Could it be that you want to go at it again? Ahem, ahem. Maisie cleared her throat to interrupt the conversation between the two and knocked on the table. You two childish boys. Are you not capable of eating your breakfast peacefully? Get out of here and find yourselves a spot outside if you want to fight. Seeing that Maisie was upset, Nolan gave up arguing immediately, lowered his head, and continued eating. Although Nolan was seemingly fearless, he was afraid of his wife getting infuriated. She would not even allow him to sleep with her this time around. A real man knows when to place his ego down. The most important thing to do now is to cheer my wife up. It was raining in downtown Bassburg. It was raining heavily. And the weather turned cold all of a sudden. The sun had been shining brightly 2 days ago, but everything was totally different now, as if the sky had suddenly decided to put on a gray sweater. The withered leaves were blown to the ground by the storm, covering the surface of the stagnant puddles. Riley was lying on the hospital bed, thinking about yesterday's kiss. She buried her face in the pillow, annoyed and perturbed. She thought it was the nurse when she heard the sound of someone pushing the door and walking into her ward. She then turned around and was taken aback when she saw the person who had entered. Zyla closed the door and turned to look at her. Ms. Hill. Riley sat up somewhat cautiously. I think you've come to the wrong ward. Lewis's ward is next door. I'm here for you. Zyla stopped by the bed with a slight smile on her face. I wish to talk to you. Riley straightened her back. What do you wish to talk about? Chapter 747. Seeing that she was acting a little vigilant and hostile against herself, Zyla laughed and explained elegantly and politely, There's no need for you to be so wary of me, Miss Hill. I won't do anything to harm you. I'm here just to talk to you. It was still raining outside. And the atmosphere in the room was stagnant for a moment as Riley's eyelids drooped. You want me to leave Lewis, don't you? Don't worry. I won't snatch him from you as soon as my engagement with him is cancelled. Rather than waiting for somebody else to come up to me and make irresponsible remarks in the future, I might as well give it to her straight now. Zyla looked at her for a long time, lowered her head, and chuckled. I really thought so before I came back to Zlokova. She looked out of the window, and a hint of loneliness flashed across her eyes. I had been with him for 6 years, and I thought that even though he had broken up with me, I'd still have the opportunity to stay by his side after returning to Zlokova. Riley was stunned for a split second and looked at her with a bewildered expression. The emotion surging in Zyla's eyes looked lonely and helpless. She looked at Riley and explained. Take this as a tiny tip from me to you. I once spent 6 years being next to him, and I still couldn't get him to accept me into his world. Zyla had first seen Lewis's performance in a musical theater, and she had admired him since then. It could be said that she was the one who had taken the initiative to court Louis actively. It was not that he had never rejected her. It was just that she did not want to give up right off the bat, and he might have given her a chance back then only because of her persistence. Louis had always been the passive one between the two of them. She had even tried to learn how to play the violin and understand his preferences in order to impress him someday in the future. Unfortunately, she could not help but admit that between her and Louis she would never catch up with him no matter how hard she tried. Even though she had taken all the steps to get into his world, he had never taken even one step toward her. Zyla was not reconciled to the fact that she still could not get what she wanted after all those things that she had done. Riley pursed her lips and looked at her sympathetically. Ms. Mayweather, it's pointless for you to tell me this. Louis and we wouldn't even have gotten to know each other if it weren't for our family's arrangements. Zyla sneered Riley. You're rejecting such a good man who's been delivered right up to you without even giving him a chance. While the same man that I desperately want to be with has never loved me. She walked up to the chair next to the hospital bed and sat down. Do you still remember when you first met Louis? Me? Riley thought about it carefully and said, I think it was 3 years ago? Although the relationship between the Hills and the Lucases has always been rather close-knitted, it's only limited to the connections that the elders of both families share. As for the both of us, I've never seen or heard of Louis before that. Zyla lowered her gaze. But he saw you a long time ago. Riley was a little gobsmacked and puzzled. But I don't know about that. I've said everything that I think I have to say. Zyla stood up slowly, stopped when she was at the door, about to leave, and turned her head to look at Riley. I really do envy you. She envies me? Riley looked at Zyla's back when she left the ward and lowered her head as something crossed her mind. She actually didn't cause me any trouble this time around but only uttered those baffling words? It was raining outside, and it was boring to stay in the ward, so Riley went out to the corridor for some free air. As soon as she got out, she happened to see Louis coming out of his ward. The two looked at each other. Riley's mind went blank again in a snap of a finger as if a certain scene had fully occupied it. Her cheeks flushed, and she quickly turned around, got back into the wards, and closed the door. She leaned against the door, feeling extremely embarrassed. Why? Just why? Louis's voice sounded from the other side of the door all of a sudden as he asked, Do you want McNuggets? Chapter 748. Riley hesitated for 3 seconds, then quickly opened the door and looked up at him. Yes. On Winston Island. 4 people sat in the car and enjoyed the island's scenery along the way. The roadside was full of cherry blossoms. And they looked as if they were parallel to the horizon, which had almost been blurred by the color of the sky and ocean as both blended into one. The scene changed and became different when the car entered the underwater tunnel and passed through the underwater platform. Many cars and buses filled with tourists were parked in the parking slots of the observation deck, and many tourists were standing in front of the observation deck to look at the vivid scene of the seabed. The car was parked in the parking lane. And Maisie and Nina got out of the car and walked toward the observation platform. Winston Island's underwater tunnel was worthy of being the largest and most expensive project Slokova had ever undergone. It was the only tunnel that allowed its users to enjoy the underwater scenery. And the tunnel had 2 layers. The upper layer contained subways for trains, and the lower layer was the expressway for vehicles. The observation deck was located above the deceleration area on the lower floor. It had an enormous parking lot designated for the people to rest and enjoy the scenery. Maisie stopped in front of the viewing window, and she could see fish of all sizes and shapes swimming in groups under the ocean. One could even encounter whales if they were lucky enough. Helios wore a mask and a cap, wrapping his face tightly. However, Nolan, standing next to him, was indeed too eye-catching. The 2 tall men who were leaning in front of the car attracted the attention of many people at once. Helios turned to look at Nolan. Can you stay away from me? Nolan crossed his arms. If you're afraid of being recognized, get back in the car. We didn't force you to get out of the car. Helios scoffed and pulled down the brim of his cap. Hey, those two look familiar. I think the one in the cap looks like Helios. The actor. Is it really him? It shouldn't be. But I seem to have once seen the man standing next to him in a magazine. But who is he? It can't be the legendary Mr. Goldman of Bassburg, can he? Nolan squinted, stretched out his hand, removed the cap from Helios' head, put it on, and walked toward Maisie. Only then was Helios able to react to his betrayal, but several people had already recognized him. It's Helios Boucher. Oh my God, I actually got to meet Helios Boucher on Winston Island. This has just made my day. Mr. Boucher, I'm your fan. I grew up watching your dramas and movies, and I love you so much. Can I get your autograph here? I want one too. Nolan looked back and saw that Helios had been buried by a group of fans in an instant. He was immediately in a good mood after managing to set up Helios. Maisie turned around and saw Nolan wearing a cap that did not suit him and wondered. Shouldn't you be in the car with Helios? After all, Helios and Nolan's status and identity made them very flamboyant men. They would be recognized with ease, especially when there were so many people. The corner of Nolan's mouth twitched. As an entrepreneur, I have nothing to worry about. It's him who has to worry. Nina seemed to have seen something. Crap. Those people have recognized Helios. I have to go back to him. Nina quickly ran in Helios' direction to rescue him. Seeing the smirk on Nolan's face gradually intensify, Maisie glanced at the cap he was wearing and squinted. This fella. He's the one who set Helios up. Isn't he? She removed the cap from Nolan's head. Nolan Goldman, you're so childish. Nolan hugged her. You've been siding with him and speaking up for him in the past 2 days. I don't like it, and I'm jealous. Maisie raised her hands to hold his cheek. Then can't you just get along with him? He disagreed. He's the one who doesn't want to get along with me. Chapter 749. Maisie had seen through his thoughts long ago. She could not understand why Nolan would have such a bad impression of Helios. It's obvious that you're the one who's creating the trouble everywhere. And you actually have the guts to blame it on others. Nolan sealed her lips with his lips, and Maisie used the cap to cover their faces for fear of being seen. He succeeded in kissing her and could not help but give off a triumphant smirk. He then buried his face in her neck. Z. When will we get the chance to be alone? I don't want to bring these 2 third wheels along with us anymore, and Maisie raised her eyebrows. And? He looked aggrieved as he rubbed his body against her. You won't even let me sleep with you at night. Maisie trembled, looked left and right, and quickly pushed his shoulders away. Don't be ridiculous. There are many people here. Nolan smiled. What about when there are not many people? She flushed with rage. Don't push your luck. He said domineeringly. I don't care. Nolan took advantage of the situation where the crowd's attention was being attracted by Helios and kissed her for 2 minutes. She would have suffocated to death if she had not taken a breath during the whole process. Nolan caressed her cheek with his fingertips, kissed her forehead, and gave off a pregnant smirk. It's either now or tonight. You can only choose one. Helios was exhausted from all his fans' selfies and autographs requests because Nolan had him up. He wouldn't have been able to leave the scene if it were not for Nina. It was already in the evening when they returned to the hotel. Helios went back to his room first because he did not have any appetite to eat dinner. Nolan and Maisie were the only ones left at dinner. Maisie knew clearly what Nolan had in mind, so she ate slowly on purpose. Even slower than Nolan. Nolan held the wine glass and swayed it gently, waiting for her to finish her meal, by the side. He had already finished the third glass of red wine while she was still eating. Knowing that Maisie was buying time deliberately, he scoffed. "Are you waiting for me to get drunk?" Maisie raised her head. "I don't mind you being drunk." Nolan propped his hand against his chin, squinted, and chuckled. "I won't get drunk, but I'll lose control very easily when I'm half drunk." Maisie took the wine glass from him. "Then don't drink any more." His smile intensified. Maisie's eyes shifted from side to side as she gave off a charming smile. She then leaned forward. "Hubby, I want to go to the hot spring first after dinner." Nolan smiled slightly. The outdoor hot spring pools of the hotel were built on the back mountain with beautiful scenery. There were private and mixed hot spring pools. The mixed hot spring pool was a public pool that welcomed men and women. Maisie reserved a private hot spring pool. And she was the first guest to arrive at the facility. She stepped into the pool wrapped in a bath towel, surrounded by a thick layer of white fog that was steaming from the spring water. She immersed herself in the water, breathed a sigh of relief, and splashed the water onto herself while leaning against the cobblestone. Who cares if Nolan is angry now? However, without her knowing, a silhouette approached her slowly and undid the bathrobe wrapped around his waist. Maisie heard the sound of someone getting into the pool, turned her head, and was startled by Nolan, who was already standing beside her. She was shocked. "Nolan, are you mad?" "This is a dash." Nolan took her into his arms and made her face him. "No one will be here." Have you reserved the whole venue?" Maisie was astounded. Nolan kissed her on the neck. "Of course." Maisie bit her lip. "You're so reckless." A despicable hint of amusement flashed across Nolan's eye as he held on to her waist. "Do you plan to make a fool out of me?" Maisie wrapped her arms around his neck. His body temperature was even more frightening than the hot spring. It felt like he was about to boil. She then said, "You've been drinking. It's not good for you to get into a hot spring now." "I didn't drink too much." His sweat dripped down from the corner of his brows as the fog shrouded his thick eyebrows, and profound emotions were surging at the bottom of his eyes. Chapter 750. Nolan looked wild and seductive at the moment. His body attracted her gaze like a magnet, making her not know where to look. Nolan carried Maisie back to the room. Maisie was leaning languidly against his chest in his arms, her wet hair was stuck against her neck, and the hue on her face made her look extremely enchanting. As soon as he placed her down on the couch, Maisie pushed him away with her feet, climbed to the side, and lay down. Nolan went into the bathroom, grabbed a towel, sat down on the edge of the couch, and started drying her hair for her with a hoarse chuckle. "You're furious again." Maisie groaned and ignored him. He patiently wiped Maisie's hair for her. "Who told you to make a fool out of me?" Maisie turned around, propped her chin on her hands, and glared at him. "Then are you saying that it's my fault?" He chuckled. No. While Nolan stroked her half-dry black hair, Maisie lay on his thigh and laughed. "Your hair feels so smooth." She lifted her eyelids and glanced at him. "You said that before." He picked up a tiny bundle of her hair and kissed it. "Oh really? It seems that even though I can't remember saying so, it's still imprinted in my memory." "Nolan." "Yeah." He looked down at her, and Maisie stared at him for a moment. "You haven't answered my question yet." "What's the question?" Maisie sat up and stared fixedly at him. "Why do you hate Helios so much?" Nolan looked away, but Maisie pushed his cheek, forcing him to look at her. "Don't you dodge the question again." He narrowed his eyes and grabbed the back of her hand. "Why do you ask about him?" "Because I'm curious." Maisie sat on top of him as if she was afraid that he would run away. "You'll continue to sleep on the couch tonight if you don't answer me." Nolan hesitated. Maisie grabbed the hem of his collar. "You'd rather sleep on the couch than beside me?" No, his eyelids drooped, looking a little awkward. I have nothing to say to that guy. Maisie was amused. Is it very embarrassing for you to say? Or is it because you were bullied by him when you were a child, and you cried out of rage back then? Nolan was at a loss for words. She stopped kissing his lips for a while. Just say it. This little imp. Nolan picked her up. Let's talk about it in another place. He then carried her and walked toward the bedroom. 2 days later. The news of Helios's trip to Winston Island had been spread on the internet thanks to his fans. He was indeed a famous actor. So famous that even a trip that he went on could secure him a place on Google Trends' top 10 trending list. Of course, Nolan had also been captured in the same photo as Helios on Winston Island. The netizens started joking around in the comment section. #Hells can't be found in the same photo as another woman. But these two do exude a strong coupling sense. Am I blind or what? #+L #I'll be damned. I hope that my idol will become a couple with Mr. Goldman. Their looks together could kill. #looking for pictures that have Mr. Goldman and Hells in them. Even fans of Helios specially created a couple stan group on Facebook known as Helios x Nolan for the two of them, which attracted 60,000 fans in just a few hours, and it was still increasing. Nina had received several calls from the company since the morning Helios trip to Winston Island was private, so no one other than his manager, Morgan, knew about it. Because of that, the company had rejected a lot of job opportunities on his behalf. Now that Helios had been exposed, the company's official phone number was about to explode from all the incoming calls. Hearing the doorbell ring, Nina went to open the door and saw Maisie standing outside the room. Mrs. Goldman? May I come in? Of course. Nina moved aside and closed the door after Maisie entered. Nina then asked her, would you like to drink something? Maisie walked to the couch and sat down. No, I came to you just because of the articles and posts that are trending on Twitter and Facebook. Nina froze. Now that all the trending posts on Twitter and Facebook are talking about Helios and Mr. Goldman, what does Mrs. Goldman think?